This is a production of Cornell University.
What I am going to try to do is basically split today into two different presentations. I do want to talk about a resiliency project that Trevor and I are working on, and I'll get into that here shortly because we're wrapping up our research. He and I are in process of doing final report for that. And then I am going to talk a little bit about ag education, because what intrigued me when I talked to Don originally is probably trying to fit how myself as an educator ends up in or feels comfortable in the horticulture section, and give you a little better feel for why I think that's a pretty solid fit, and hopefully going forward we can continue to develop that. So two-stage, it'll be about half and half if all goes well. Trevor will have to wave at me if I'm going too slow on the research project. So the first one is the report from a resiliency growth project that we're just wrapping up. We probably really got kicked off in January of this year. Folks involved in that, Trevor is a graduate student and myself as principal investigator. We do have Betsy Bin, who's based in Geneva, also member of the horticulture field that's co-PI on it. Dr. Nancy Wells is in human ecology and is working with Trevor as his primary chair and has been involved. Mark Smith's been very involved in our initial establishment and in thinking about the research. Keith Tidball from Eden has also been a collaborator throughout, because we've been using his resource base and we're actually hitting topics that are very near and dear to Eden as it comes up in our discussion. Caroline Quentin was an outstanding undergraduate of mine who I didn't know until we got going is absolutely talented in coding interview texts. So she took right off with that and was a great deal of help. So I have to give a shout out to her as well. It was funded by Empire State Development. I give credit to Betsy, is the one that kind of flagged this at me. Hey, this is a project that's getting ready to move down the pike. Do you want to get involved with it? Its primary emphasis to get into that is basically stemming from a whole series of pretty severe storms that we've had, starting with Hurricane Irene, including Hurricane Sandy and Lee. And then we had early spring and a really late frost in 2012. And we had unusual flooding in Penyan that they didn't see coming, because it was basically not something they had ever really planned on or experienced before. And then we had, while we're in the middle of this, we had the Buffalo severe snowfall event in 2014. That was the impetus. It was back in Irene and Lee was the original driving force for the funding from the Empire Development Agency group to do a little bit of studying on the idea of resiliency within our agricultural sector. What do we need to do, and where are we currently at in terms of resiliency in that particular arena? Specific weather impacts that we start looking at. Half of Orange County's cultivated land was damaged in Irene. Crop losses just in Ulster County were about 5 million. We didn't have numbers, but from the Schoharie Action Report, the farms were devastated, a lot of animals were lost. Basically, the entire infrastructure was underwater. I've got a friend of mine whose house was under 14 feet of water in Schoharie Valley. They had a lot of issue with fall crop damages. The crops were there, but they were so silted in. They had to rethink how to harvest and could they harvest. It was really pushing them beyond the realm of anything they'd experienced in severe weather and trying to react to that and bounce back. Potential impact. I had Jim Held from Empire Development pull some numbers. If we totally wiped out, and this is specific to the regions that we use for focus groups. I'll show the next slide. So these numbers are very, very localized to specific counties that we were working with. Pulled out, basically we're looking at about $1 billion in sales, just of agricultural sales, from the group of counties that we were working with in our focus groups. So in the end, we're just in the few counties that we're talking about, it was about $7 billion generated that potentially could be lost. That's not actual losses, that's just potential if we had a total washout like Schoharie Valley. So I was just trying to get an idea of, because some of the discussion is, well, why are we even considering this? Is this that big a deal? Well, from an economic standpoint in those communities, it's a really big deal. Plus we included some jobs in those particular areas and earnings from those particular jobs, but the sales are really what kind of drive the point home. So that's potential impact if we totally wiped out the sections we were talking about. The focus group regions, so this slide attaches directly to the colored counties. They are totals just of the colored counties. I just had Jim run that data so we can compare within the different focus groups. I wanted to see if there was any huge difference from the Western New York group to the Ulster Green Columbia County group. And we really didn't find they were very similar across those economic impacts, which was interesting given the diversity of our New York State. This slide we can bounce back to, but this is the focus group that we started working with. When I get into the actual methodology, we'll refer back to that slide, because each color code is a group that we pulled together for focus groups to talk to producers. And I'll get there in just a minute. The overall goals of the project, really we had three particular areas of interest. We're trying to outline economic impacts and define where producers were in terms of extreme weather. It was a good, diverse discussion to have. We've talked to North Country folks. They're already familiar with snow. Snow wasn't a huge issue. They automatically reverted back to the ice storm, which was way outside of our scope, but there were still scars in there that's what they needed to talk about. It was the one time where they were totally caught off guard, and they learned quite a bit from being out of power for an extended period of time. We start talking to Schoharie, and Schoharie obviously was the severe flooding. We start talking to the Buffalo region. They weren't quite as concerned. They'd gotten through the snow event, but there were some other issues that they had. They were really where the frost event started to become very crisp in their minds when they started talking about trying to figure out how to recover and plan ahead in that extreme weather case. We also were looking at strengths and weaknesses of emergency response systems. Is the communication system that we already have in place effective or not effective, as seen from the producers, as well as our non-producer groups? So we had two different groups that I'll show in our methods courses, or methods discussion. And then really trying to assess farmers' concern regarding severe weather events and disaster planning. Are they doing anything for planning? Are they worried about severe weather? How does this topic impact them? And are they considering that as we move forward? So those three goals were the overarching perspective of the project. Had 6 different research questions, which will pop up again, that really we tried to address those specific goals are. Preventative steps that were already in place, additional, what didn't we have in terms of preventative steps for the event that they were focusing on, what factors impacted decisions. We had one farmer that was adding, it wasn't weather related, but he was now investing $20,000 for deer fence because he'd made a decision that it was finally time to invest that money. He was losing too much from deer impact, which wasn't weather related specifically, although in the last couple winters we start talking about deer pressure because of the heavy snow load. The deer pressure was directed towards them because it was food source. Then we ended up with factors impacting those responses. The note, basically we've got, along with the producers, we're also looking at extension educators, we're looking at researchers, and we're looking at state agencies, Ag and Markets, Red Cross, DEC, what were their interests and what were their thoughts compared to the producers. So we've got those two non-producer groups and producer groups that were a subset and also part of our focus group that I'll get to in just a second. What new capacity is needed to mitigate? So what do we have to add to this? And do we have capacity already in our land grant system, extension of research, to respond to weather-related crises, or are there areas that we need to develop? So we're really looking for where are we at, what can we move forward to. It was very exploratory in nature. The last one, how do we evaluate our response to disaster and assess the strength of networks used to coordinate efforts? That one was it was a great idea to have that on the list. We got very little feedback from that in our focus groups. That one basically went unanswered because we couldn't gather, the data was just not developed in the way we presented our interview formats. Methods, really, we've got 6 regions identified, which was the colored map that I showed a little earlier. We've got producers in each of those areas. The producers were invited by any means we could. I think Trevor and I both thought we were going to be in, it made good sense. We were providing them a stipend to pay for their time. We're providing them lunch, and we were trying to do it off harvest times, and we still struggled. In some cases, some counties were really, really engaged, but we weren't getting the participation that we wanted. We worked farther out into our network of Extension and Farm Bureau to populate the focus groups. We did get very interested participants, but we were a little thinner than we thought in total numbers. And we really tried to address that as we move forward, and we're consistently thwarted in our efforts to double the size of our focus groups. But we were basically at 6 or 8 participants per focus group, which worked well for in-depth discussion. I would have liked to have had a second focus group in each region, and we were unable to do that. Beyond the producers, we did pull in a state agency. All the groups listed came together in Albany for a focus group to get their perspective. We pulled in 2 different extension educators groups, one in the western part of the state, one in Hudson Valley, as well as some local participants in the focus groups that we had in our producer sections. We did have one at Syracuse with FSA representatives as one, because they're a direct link up to the federal level. Tried to have some other producers come in on that one, and it ended up being just the FSA group. Very intriguing discussion points when we started talking from FSA and their connection to the feds and the states compared to our other ones. Script and the questions were developed, one for producers. We slightly modified it for non-producers. Both were approaching the 6 research questions and developing directly from those. All meetings were actually recorded and then transcribed, and we used MaxQDA software for coding analysis. But our analysis took 2 different paths. We've got one that's really using the coding system, using MaxQDA, and we've got some results based on that. We then actually took a little more of I guess it was a high energy approach, where Trevor and I basically went back through our transcripts as we were coding and then started to break out into charts the differences across all those research groups, trying to get a little deeper than just the coding, because we were finding the coding was giving us some raw results, and we needed to find some actual specifics down underneath. So we did another layer that we'll see here shortly when we start talking about results. When we break out the coding, the nice thing is it kind of hits you with the broad spectrum discussion points of what we found right away. Right off the bat, 137 citations for resource demand and influence. The producers, this is from the producers, really needed, the thing they were looking for is continued development of opportunities for continued resource development, and how do we connect to those resources. And it was across the spectrum, because we did have each focus group had different target points. One was the North Country, where they were talking ice and transportation of foodstuffs. If the roads are shut down, how are we going to get through our product to the market, and how do we get food up into the region if we don't have that food available? Where we start talking in Western New York, they weren't quite as worried about that. They were much more worried about simply clearing the snow out of the way and then worrying about water. We had some water discussions out that way. So it really was very much independent of their focus groups, which makes intuitive sense. But they all did focus for 137 references on resources. The other one that was very similar in height is emergency communication. And that didn't distinguish positive and negative. It just noted in the coding that it was related to emergency communication. The good news of this discussion was they were very happy with the emergency communication system as a general feel from the state level down to the county level. We were at first, one of the driving forces for this study was there a connection? Were the producers feeling well connected to the emergency systems when something happens? And across all the focus groups, they were actually quite positive with their county systems and their connections to Ag and Markets. Ag and Markets has, it's one woman is basically runs that whole emergency management system. They all knew her, and she's very well connected to all the counties, and it was very encouraging to hear that. At the same time, we'd have a discussion on the negative side. The local folks weren't talking to the counties. So the villages were disconnected with the counties. So in some cases, there was a breakdown of communication there. There were some counties that had some variability of breakdown from the producer side to the emergency response side. There was variability in there, but across the board, they were very positive. They also saw extension. I think it'll show up in another one. Extension, soil and water, and their emergency response teams were very active in making sure that the ag community was brought into the fold when a disaster hit. The extension service was cited 62 times in our discussion as well. That was part of a discussion to see how they were fitting into the county level. If you're familiar with the extension system, it is some counties are very strong associations. Some counties have very limited associations based on budgetary constraints and some historical resource points. We saw that variation, but overall, across the focus groups we were working with, they were very positive about their extension systems. If the extension educators weren't there, the soil and water folks picked that up. The recovery issues weren't quite as strong as the top three, but we're still, that was basically talking about, okay, what we're really worried about is the aftermath. How do we pick up the pieces and keep moving forward? This is where crop insurance starts popping up as a reference point, which we'll see in a specific site. We were talking about tying the resources into recovery. Do we have generators for a long enough period of time? Do we have the planning in place so that we can actually get to the resources and establish recovery? So those were just the key results from the coding breakout. But as I talked, Trevor and I got talking and wanted to go a little more in depth to try to connect those core, really broad stroke pieces to some specific details. Further analysis, just some examples that pop up under resources. The big one that hammered basically across all the counties, and we've already, if you've listened to NPR, it's one of Governor Cuomo's points already. Internet access and cell phone coverage is very weak in some of our areas. We get producers where it's not available even on a good day, let alone in a disaster. Now, a lot of the communication systems are starting to expect us to have cell phones and internet connection, where we've got parts in our counties that don't have that. Even on a good day, it's extremely slow. That's becoming an issue that was very vocalized. They're like, we need to fix that first, and then we can build up from there. North Country was talking about generators. They've basically already solved that problem, but it seemed to be their key point that was in the back of their minds. The other operations, I mentioned transportation and infrastructure, were really, they said, yeah, that's fine for the dairies, but the non-dairies were really worried more about getting produce or product out from their farms or into the community to make sure the communities had resources just to not stress because of lack of food and basic supplies. Emergency communication related topics, as I mentioned, the county and state were really seen as satisfactory. The local level had an awful lot of variability depending on whether they thought to read their emails and were they engaged in the practices for emergency response. The federal level I was hoping to have better connection to the federal level, and even at the state level, they didn't have a good, clear vision of the connection back up to FEMA. And whenever you talk about FEMA, that fizzled out really, really fast. There was not as much discussion about that federal connection, even from the state level, as I expected. The state is very organized and has a lot of plans in place. The federal level, when we connect up to that Fed level, a lot of it goes through FSA. And the FSA discussion was there's some internal communication issues. So the federal level, we've got more work to do. That one basically didn't have the data we wanted to pull together.
You should probably define FSA.
Ah, yes, thank you. FSA is Farm Service Agency, very involved in providing resources from the federal level, both to farms that meet specific qualifications. They are also, the Farm Service Agency is the primary agency that will do decide on a federal declaration of disaster. It funnels through their agency for whatever reason. When the state starts looking at the point where it's so bad that they've got to go at the federal level for disaster, which opens up federal aid back to the state. So that Farm Service Agency is a conduit for that, but it's primarily seen as a lending resource for farmers that meet the requirements that they set for federal aid. Thank you, Don, for clarifying that. And as I talked about, the Extension Service and Soil and Water Districts are very involved in each of the regions. It's kind of what we expected, but there was some discussion of how broadly that's going to show up, and both of them were very strongly reported. The other thing I'm going to do, when I watch my time, I truncated these. These are splitting the other direction, so we've got a producer response on the left and non-producers on the right. These are related to, each number is one of the 6 research questions that we focused on. Effective preventative steps, one element that popped up here and didn't show up on the coding, the use of pictures and internet, on phones and internet to send information right away. Eden uses this already. They start doing, what's the term for it, Trevor? We're doing, crowdsourcing. They're doing crowdsourcing to map their data as the event hits. The educators are sending in information off their phones right away, so in a very short period of time in the middle of the crisis, they can start to populate where the issues are happening. It's especially when we start talking to Eden about, we had a hail event in Homer that I don't think anybody else in Cortland or Tompkins County had. I've got 10 or 15 houses that are replacing their entire siding and roofing through insurance because they had hail damage in this one 5 to 10 acre plot. I don't know, when I talked to the growers, that they didn't see any damage because it was mostly hay, but those types of things are being identified through this use of crowdsourcing. That was one effective preventative step. Additional preventative step, economic marketing and analysis, some room for improved ideas and some tools so that they can start to identify how do we make a change, what do we do as part of the plan, what's the cost if we don't choose to do that. If we say, okay, I want to invest in, one thing we talked about was water as a big topic. Do we not only flooding, but also water retention? Should we be paying attention to storing more of the water that we have so that if we are going to carry through times like our August was really, really dry, not all farms are set up for irrigation and don't have the water resources. Should we be leaning that way? That was a discussion that came up in our summit, which I'll get to in a minute. So some more thought process of tools the producers can use because they're starting to think about these issues. The non-producers really were also confident in the communication. They did see some issues with soil erosion after the storm and trying to improve exposure for New York Eden. New York Eden is the Extension Disaster Education Network based in natural resources here on campus. And they are they've got really great resources, but there was a discussion of trying to make sure they're getting their message out more to a broader population. So that it's there, but needs to grow. The third and fourth ones, factors impacting economic decisions. Again, they wanted some more tools to use for cost-benefit analysis as they do work on their planning. The responses were very individualized depending on what focus group you were working with. As a whole, clear communication from county to state level, I already hit that. On the non-producer side, the one thing we talked about was economics of design. We were talking about the Buffalo snowstorm where a lot of barns had collapsed, and just having some numbers and some tools because you can't, and the one situation we also talked about was a greenhouse, an entire greenhouse business that was totally flattened. And you can only reinforce and overbuild greenhouses so far before they become cost prohibitive. And have that discussion and to start to look at some economics. They used to do that back when this was ag engineering. We had all sorts of tables for some of that type of resource. We hadn't seen that at the state level in the agencies. They hadn't seen new data relative to snow loads, and thought that was interesting to consider as an option. And then one thing they brought up was once you go through the flood or you go through the snowstorm, you're better prepared next time, which is totally intuitive. But they brought that to the point of, okay, when we start working with the producers that have done this, they're a lot more prepared the next time. We just have to get their neighbors to learn. If neighboring counties didn't go through the Schoharie flood, learn from what they're doing and try to grow before it hits them personally. Last two, we already talked about internet and cell phone coverage for response in terms of new capacities. There was a mention of GPS locations available, which counties should already have, but we were unsure of the uniformity across the counties. Areas for further research. One area was, and this was the area for future resource, really emphasized small scale agriculture, but that was also the nature of the focus groups that we had. Our Batavia group was probably the only one that I can think of that we had large operators there, just by nature. We were in Schoharie. Schoharie had a couple too, that's true. So we had large operators in Schoharie and large in Batavia, but the other ones were primarily just self-selected to be smaller operators. The larger ones were pointedly invited, but chose not to participate. So it's one of the biases and issues we have with the focus group format. But they liked a little more resources put into extension, which we're already trying to do from Cornell University, doing our active research out to the extension offices. I think that pathway could be strengthened, and that's one of the points they bring up there. Also, they brought up FSA does a similar crowdsource thing where they've got data from their agents and that they didn't realize Eden was using it and vice versa. It'd be really great if they could just communicate a little bit so they had a really strong resource base. I'm trying to make those connections because the two groups had not actually sat down and had a discussion about how each of their crowdsourcing worked. And then one element we also talked about from the state agency-wise, what happens if the cell phone system is down and the internet's down? Do we have a mechanism in place when it gets bad enough where the cell towers are out and the internet's down because the infrastructure is overflowed? So, similar to what happened in Sandy. That hasn't been answered or addressed. Some of the cell phone towers now have generators, which will help, but that was one of those that everybody's like, ooh, yeah, okay, we don't want to go there. So we need to start having that discussion of what's the next step to make sure our infrastructure is stabilized. Concept map, we also took the overall coding laid out and tried to come up with a flow chart just to conceptualize what we're talking about. Really, the trigger is a severe weather event. The interesting thing we found is basically all the producers agreed they're either the low end of emergency planning or moderate planning. Nobody honestly said they were an outstanding planning, so I left damage in there instead of a high level of planning. So after the event, if we go through low level of plan, that's going to cause some adaptation by force because they weren't prepared for it, something has happened and they've got to catch back up. If they had a moderate level of plan, they're going to show some resiliency, so it's not going to affect them quite as much. That'll trigger down into that affects all of our producers, but also brings the government levels in. The government meaning local and county levels. We start feeding in information and resources from the Ag Service agencies into the producers, and that producer can start working with the resources that they have or the resources that they need to track down, as well as trying to refine the emergency planning resources are feeding up into communications resources and planning as a thought process to realize that those producers have to engage with all three of those towards the idea of bringing the resources in. And this is probably the second iteration, maybe the third iteration of the model. We keep trying to refine how to best present the flow because it's not exactly linear, simply because that's the nature of the severe weather process. There are a couple models that I could pull in my other resource or the next phase of this, some research I'm doing in my dissertation. I've got a different set of models that probably we could compare with this. We weren't trying to do that. We were just trying to explain what happened in the information we collected. We did have a couple community values, just statements that Trevor had pulled out that really kind of said what they were thinking from producers' perspective. You know, in my community, we've got a farming attitude. Everybody cares about his neighbor, and that's worth more than anything else. There's no government program that can replace that. They're going to make sure, and these are farmers basically saying, okay, I'm going to be a farmer. We're going to make sure we're going to solve the problem one way or the other. They aren't actively going out looking for resources from the community. They like to have that infrastructure there, but they're also, in some cases, the first ones, I think, down at the bottom. I think the farmer, just as a whole, we have the ability to deal. We're the ones that are going to clean up if there's a major weather event, or make the repairs, or replant, or rebuild with the help of the insurance company. They'll step in and make sure the resources are provided. I know one of the growers I talked to, worst case scenario, he takes the tractor down the road, opens the road up because the plows haven't gotten that far and the milk truck can get through. That brings up an interesting discussion of liability, which we started to discuss, but at the end of the day, they're going to solve the problem. And so that came through and quite regularly is, yes, the communication system is pretty solid, but we also feel if we've got a good moderate level of planning, we can weather most of the incidents. I'm not sure, I think that was also the opinion of Schoharie County until they got hit with a 500-year flood level that they weren't expecting, and they had to rethink their level of preparation. We then, as a final piece, pulled together, what do we have, about 50 to 60 individuals in Geneva for a resiliency summit as part of the grant. That was the next stage where we brought in some researchers, a different set of educators, and a couple producers, and key pieces surfaced here that we didn't see in our focus groups. The two big ones were water retention and erosion issues, especially retention. Should we be paying attention to keeping the water on site instead of letting it go down the rivers, or do that as some mitigation for flooding in a broader perspective? Soil quality and stabilization. We had one producer that was adamant that should have been, and it is important. I think we were phrasing it such that was an understanding, but should we be paying attention to make sure that this doesn't infringe on our soil quality? Economic incentives. How do we get the producers to engage in emergency planning? The smaller guys don't have the time and don't feel they have the money. The larger operators all have some degree of emergency planning built into the CAFOs and their nutrient plans. Are they actually implementing the process? A lot of times it'll sit on the shelf. How do we encourage them to actually think of this as part of their planning? The ag businesses are not always connected to the county EMS system. emergency management systems. So the businesses quite often are. The agricultural businesses sometimes are separated out and are not as tightly aware. We did talk about crop insurance. That popped up quite a bit. Everybody agreed it's an important tool, but it has some flaws in terms of being designed for Midwest where we struggle to adapt it. Overall, county planning is also seen as strong, but there were some communication gaps. Next steps from that, we're basically doing a summary report, but from the summit, we've actually got Ag and Markets connected with Trevor and I, and we're working on a next step. They'd like to take another step forward. We haven't discussed what that was, but he's excited to meet with me in November to figure out how we move forward along with Keith out of Eden. Trevor is doing a perception of climate change from the producers, so we're trying to go in that direction. I'm actually taking a dissertation off of this base grant, looking specifically at the county level. There's a local emergency planning committee mandated by the state. So every state has one, or every county has one, but I'm also finding in talking to a couple of them, there's an interesting amount of variability in terms of how useful they are. That's where the agricultural folks should have connections to the emergency response. It's not happening in all the counties. So the next step is to figure out why that's not happening, even though it's mandated by the state. In some cases, the connections are not being made. In some counties, they're being very well made, and it's not as much of an issue. So those are the three different directions we're going to go. Right out of the report, we're going to develop fact sheets and tease out the data into some more specific details we can send back to our extension agents. So they've got a growth point. There was a lot of interest in the summit to just summarize where this was as a launching point. There's also money coming through to soil and water agencies for more specific water mitigation, manure storage, cover mitigation, and there was a third one, would have been related to soil, that they're getting ready to roll out as well. So as an exploratory project, it seemed to develop the interest and start to answer some of the missing information pieces that we couldn't find in the literature. All right, any questions on that? And then I'm going to switch to my ag education piece. So this is phase one. Yes?
Based on what you found out, can you paint a picture of innovative, sustainable, resilient mechanisms for connection? You did something different?
One that we actually had in the Resiliency Summit was there's SALT, which is a community-generated program in Schoharie County that's totally community funded, and they're actually establishing resource networks and a much tighter understanding of the resources that are available and the planning that's necessary to meet that 500-year flood. So they've been around for, Trevor, 3 years, totally originally grant funded, and now they're establishing the resource and much more careful data points so everybody in the community has some access to what happens if this develops. And that was really a model we had presented at the summit that I think more counties where there's a high risk factor could use to just establish. They have a couple people on staff and they actively work with the community members to make sure that level of emergency planning is high. Because then you can vary depending on what the producer needs are and the community needs are. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? We can come back to these if you want. I'm going to keep going because I worry about getting running out of time. So that was the research we've been working on, which side project. My day job, ag education and SIPs. I'm associated with the agricultural outreach program. You probably not see most of these folks. Katie works out of the office in the North Country. She's a director of New York Ag in the Classroom, deals with K through 12 educators. The Ag Literacy Day where they read a children's book that's factually accurate for agriculture to, I don't remember how many thousands of children each year. That's one of her big projects. The FFA Executive Secretary, currently Julia Tolofsky, we just hired Derek Hill. Julia's going to Minnesota, manages the FFA. We've got 6,000 students in ag programs across the state, which I'll show you a map of. She manages those. She's on campus. Terry and Sherry one's in Cobleskill and one is in the North Country, providing recruitment specialists and also support for agricultural education teachers. That community is part of who as I assume the director responsibilities, that'll be the team that I'm working with. My key job is really working in the ag science realm. I've got 23 ag science advisees that really focus on the soils, crops, horticulture, and education perspectives. So I just kind of shepherd them through as undergraduates and make sure they're focusing on whatever perspective they have and refine their career choices as we go through. The education minor has about 75. Each class, underclass group has about 75 participants, continuing to grow a little bit. Brian Duff and I basically are working with the rest of our faculty. There's education faculty in development soc and art anthropology that shepherd the minor and maintain that. The other key piece, at least to me, the exciting part is I teach the art of teaching. It's a large survey course, university-wide. It's about 300 students a year. Every semester we run that, and I've got Trevor's in there now as my graduate TA, along with Emily Dietrich. And we've had, I think, 3 different years. This is a 3rd year running graduate teaching opportunities for horticulture students, and it's been outstanding. Each one, Emily's got an interest in public gardens and some art history background, and it's been a really strong connection. Grant Thompson last year was outstanding and really has shown some growth as he prepares for teaching in his professional career. So it's been a great opportunity to present. I also, so my other job, I guess it comes up in my next slide, 2 more slides. I also am coordinating the student teaching and agricultural education project at Ithaca College. Cornell used to have ag education master's program. That dissolved in 2013 due to funding and political situations. But at the same time, the dean reached out and picked up Ithaca College's program, and we've partnered with them. And half of what we do is actually, the whole thing is really plant and animal based. A good half of what we do in ag education is plant based. The other half is going to be animal science based. This is actually a picture of my greenhouse when I taught in high school. We were doing some irrigation work and also trying to work on some potting development. And I've also got good alignment with both extension programs across the state and the public garden, Marshim Shively and the projects between that and plantations. We're building stronger and stronger connections across those opportunities. I also teach an extension outreach and instruction course that align much better with the public garden and extension perspective, because it's not specifically high school. A few details about the ag education piece. All the blue, actually all the colors, the red colors are colleges. All the other colleges, or all the other dots, blue and green, have some connection to a high school agricultural program. In some cases, they're fully fledged ag programs with a certified teacher. In some cases, they don't have a certified teacher, but they're teaching an environmental science through a science teacher, or they're teaching aquatics. Down on Long Island, I've got a couple marine science programs. They're not certified ag teachers, they're certified biology. But all these folks have been somehow engaged with our agricultural resource folks. In terms of specific ag, we're talking about 250 teachers with 4 positions open right now that I can't fill. So the growth is actually an upward swing. That's where this comes in, supply and demand. Nationally, all the red states are in shortage for ag teachers. Again, I'm drawing from animal science heavily. I'm also drawing from ag science, agricultural science majors to draw them into the master's program as one opportunity for the careers to teach. At least I taught for 17 years, then I transitioned to FarmNet, and now I've transitioned to here. It's something that they can at least keep in the back of their mind. I've got one young man not teaching in high school. He went through ag education, got certified, and Case IH made a position for him. He's training people across the Midwest for whatever they want him to train. But they hired him because of his educational and marketing skills. So there's definitely a shortage across most parts of the country. Our pathway is connecting with Ithaca College. We've got an articulation agreement, so there's 9 credits, actually up to 12 credits that can transfer across the 2 institutions. We'll start up the first cohorts this May. I'll probably have 6 teachers that are in a 13-month program that'll be on campus for a couple of the classes, and then I'll supervise their student teaching out into the workforce as well. Personal background, which is a deeper connection to my agricultural roots. Don mentioned my ostrich. I raised ostrich for 10 years. in Western New York. That's I got a different PowerPoint on that. We can talk about that. And the market's basically dissolved. So I've switched to heritage breed hogs. This is one of my American guinea hogs. My daughter, the artist, snapped that picture. We're working with American guinea hogs just as a hobby now. Did work professionally as a landscaper in Blacksburg while I was putting myself through graduate school. I actually taught horticulture and turf and golf course design for actually 15 years, not 17. 15 years in Western New York, along with forestry. And then Don had mentioned my BS here in ag education and my master's at Virginia Tech. Questions?
Wow. Well, first of all, Jeff, I want to commend you for being the first speaker in the past 2 years who has actually finished early. That is extraordinary.
Figured we had to have some time for questions because this was kind of off the beaten track.
A question actually more for Trevor, possibly. To what degree did you see the participants in your focus groups make a tie-in between these individual extreme weather events and the broader subject of global climate change?
So we kept climate change out of our script. We didn't reference it at all. And I would say it probably came up, it wasn't in every focus group, but it was probably in around, let's say, half.
Yep, I would say 50%. Just brought it up of their own volition because we were actively told to not use the term climate change based on their funder. So it came up 50% of the time organically as part of our discussion. Any other questions?
Excellent questions. Well, thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you very much, guys.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.